to the Accelerate podcast. And today I'm excited to speak to Courtney Cunningham, who is a product ops practitioner and also product leader today. He is a fractional CPO. So welcome to the podcast. And Courtney, come to you. Tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're interested in, sharing with us around running product at speed and accelerate outcomes.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. So my name is Courtney, and I'm a partner at Fractional CPO. And what we do is embed product leaders for interim periods of time within companies to help them navigate change. And so it's usually companies that are going through a leadership transition, or maybe there's a reorganization, or they just have special initiatives that they want extra support around. Then we'll embed with the company for a period of time to help them along with that. My background is in engineering and then product management. I started as an entrepreneur before getting into product management and then eventually transitioning over to product operations, which has been the bulk of my focus for the last, let's say, 3 years or so.
Very cool. And you cannot pick a better time to be the person that embedded it in when change is happening. Because right now, every company is going through the change with AI, agentic, and all the other good stuff. So maybe share with us a little bit of, since you're brought into organizations during pretty critical moments of a change, what are some of those setups and how you think and how your client think that someone like your experience, product operations or product leaders can help drive or shape and form that process?
Yeah, I think it's going to be different for different companies. I worked in the high growth startup environment. My current company tends to deal more with established companies that are going through change. So in that sense, it's usually about either a lack of structure or an older structure that needs to be updated. And it's not because it's implemented wrong, it's because it was built for a different time and it worked back then, but then it hasn't been maintained or updated while the business is changing. So companies change, and if the underlying operating system or motion that was put in place several years ago doesn't change either, then they end up with quite a bit of friction. So I do see, I do work with companies that are going through transitions, and so that can be very disruptive. And so naturally, it's almost always the case that your operating model is a part of that change.
Right. So I like you mentioned something about the operating model and the underlying operating systems. So share a little bit of how do you see your customers or industry in general that is being shifting, adapting, especially now with AI. But let's put AI on the side for a second, just in general. What are some of the trend or changes, and what are some of the way that people think about it that it's the right way, or some of them may not be the right direction, so that as you adjust the frame of thinking, that could be driving a different outcome.
Well, I'd say one of the challenges that I've seen several times is we're looking at it through the lens of transformation, and so therefore it gets a very project feel about it. And so you want to move from, your old state to the new state, and there's a sense that updating your operating system can be managed like a single project that has some sort of end date. And I think this is kind of the transformation way of thinking. But in reality, I found that to be very difficult and doesn't really land. That type of thinking causes people to try and tackle a much bigger beast than really makes sense. You're really trying to understand the full scope of your operating system. And that's when we get into these requests where a certain executive might say, we need a new PDLC. I'm like, well, what does that mean exactly? What do you mean you need a new PDLC? The whole thing? And why exactly is that sort of the frame of mind? So when I'm with companies that are working that way, the mode I'm trying to move towards is more of like just more of a traditional like agile approach to the problem set. It's what are the observations that are really causing the sense of like we need a new system, and trying to approach it more in a bottoms up fashion where we prioritize the problem sets and then we work with teams to go and implement them one by one, and you grow an operating system instead of trying to scope it out and then implement it top down. And that's the more traditional transformation approach that causes quite a bit of friction.
Interesting. Typically, when you say improvement, that will be bottoms up, right? Regardless of the Toyota's, sort of the factory floor and a drive efficiency, or sort of like you said, the agile teams that figured out where things are broken. Now, when it comes to transformation, it tends to be something, at least the intent, right? The drive or the focus is top down, because otherwise there's inertia from organization to move.
Mhm.
It seems to me, at least, it seems like you kind of need both, right? There should be a drive and end state, or not end state, at least the sort of the milestones of each of them. And then the teams can say, hey, how do we solve sort of the two approaches? So, but you kind of mentioned also that the intent from executive tend to be a project. So tell me a little bit of how do you reconcile that? What are some of the good ways of doing that so that the bottoms up is not incremental, or the top down is disruptive?
Yeah, you bring up a good point. When you're doing operating system work, there's different levels to it. There is the top-down authority or intent that is definitely like required. You need the executive team to push forward the intent to improve and the intent to change. I've actually seen where that isn't present, and that in itself becomes an issue because it actually gets delegated over to product ops, and then that becomes a bit of a tricky situation for that product ops person to navigate. And then you have the top-down intent. You have the things you can see, feel, and touch, this the operating system itself. And that is the domain of product operations. But you also then have the behavior change. And the behavior change is mostly where the bottoms up really needs to come from. If I'm trying to help build an operating system, I'm kind of product managing it, right? So I'm thinking about the needs of the system, but I really need to partner with the actual specialist to design what the solution is. And so that's where I feel the bottoms up approach is most important. When I'm trying to tackle the overall request of like, hey, we don't think the current system is fit for purpose. We need a way of approaching it. I found the best method that's worked for me and worked for people who I've seen do this is just to bring a bunch of stakeholders together and do, I think it's called event storming. You do like an event storming workshop. It's pretty simple. You sort of draw two circles on a really large whiteboard with a line between them representing start and end, and you're thinking of the workflow that the product org moves along. And you have everyone in the meeting kind of put stickies along this line that represent key events in your workflow. And the idea is that it will surface, roughly speaking, the key events and requirements that this business needs to do its work. And as people talk, you'll start to see, oh, that doesn't seem to work, or that doesn't happen in this kind of a team, like in a product growth team. They're running quite different from this other team that does things in a 0 to 1 way. So then you start to see the differences in how the organization works, because it's rarely the case that one way of working is going to work for everyone. And in the same sort of a session, you then start looking for the gaps. Where's the pain points? Where's the friction? And this is a much simplified version of what a full event storming workshop would look like. But this, for me, is the best way to gain alignment around what's the current system, because that's often not defined. And it's a good starting point to understand what is the current way of working. When we talk to clients, one of the things we talk about is you have a vision for how your company is supposed to be working. We'll tell you what they're actually doing. And that's a really good starting point. And then you have the gaps, you have the problem statements, and you can tackle that more in a problem by problem fashion. And in that case, you can now partner bottoms up with product teams. So for example, if you've identified one area of key friction, you can go and look for the team that has experienced that more recently or frequently, whichever one comes to mind, and go partner with that team to provide that solution. And then you bubble that up to the rest of the organization. So now when people hear about, oh, this is how we're going to do, let's say road mapping. Let's say the business wants a consistent way that people roadmap. This is commonly asked for. When you're getting one of the actual teams in the organization to be the one to author what that solution is and bring it up to everyone else, the adoption of that is going to be a lot better than some outside, I say outside, but some product ops person saying, okay, well, here's what road mapping should look like. I spoke to all the stakeholders.
Right, because there's a change aspect to it, right? So that people will have to buy into how they are either like how they practice today and understand the good part of it and challenge part, and then the part needs to leave. So it kind of going back a little bit to what you're saying earlier. So I want to double click on that. What you are describing is sort of the mapping out the PDLC, right? So think about it from the very beginning of the PDLC, at least at the team level, how it is done today. Maybe different teams work differently, but the PDLC itself is the part where you get the workshop people understand what do I do, what they do, what kind of deliverables and dependencies I have. And then you would identify areas of friction that you would modify that and so forth. Now, when you did mention earlier that people will come to you, right? Your client or executive come to you and say, we need a new PDLC. So would be good to sort of connect that a little bit. And you said, hey, why, right? So what is typically what they think about it when they say they need a new PDLC? Do they see the same as their team, or they're different? How does that
No.
typically go?
I find there's usually very large gaps between what they see and what the team see. And they're probably coming towards the same thing, but they're just seeing it from very different perspectives. One, on the idea of leadership asking for the PDLC to change, since we're talking about the messy reality of things, I've fallen into this trap, and I've seen other product ops leaders fall into this trap of kind of running with that request, of we need to update the PDLC, or I need a new operating system, or however it's phrased. And when you do that, it sounds really basic that you should push back and maybe ask, well, why, what's the problems? Like, what are you observing? Can you co-author the hypothesis with me? Because this is actually a very vague request, but we often don't do that. And then we sort of go into it with the idea that this is a problem. And then you go and talk to the teams and they're like, I have this one issue. Why do I have to worry about all this other stuff? Product teams are busy. They're focused on their products and their customers and their team. And a lot of the time, they have their way, like they have their way of working that they're already quite comfortable with. And there's some friction of trying to get them involved in a really context-heavy thought process of, oh, we got to think about how this works for all the different teams. So leadership tend to look at it like, how can I get something that I can ingest and understand? Oh, this is how my organization works. But teams will look at it from like, well, what works for me? Because I have unique requirements. I may be a 0 to 1 product team. Like I don't need all the stuff that's applicable to teams that are maybe working on the platform or something. So usually if they ask that, like that request of, hey, we need a new operating system, I would try to push back and say, well, look, let's go map out where we are today and let's actually validate if that is what we should be doing. Because if we do map it out, we might find, wow, there really is like no consistency and structure here. So let's go put in the bare bones of how we do some key cross-functional things. And that will look like a V1 operating system to your leadership. And it's something the product teams can get on board with. But you don't try and tackle all areas of the PDLC. So when I'm doing the workshop, I'm not trying to actually draft a new version of that workflow. I'm just trying to figure out what should we be fixing? Where's the pain? Where's the gap, particularly cross-functionally? So you can kind of come at it with that approach. To the leadership, it looks like a minimum viable system. And to the teams, it's like, okay, this makes sense. There's a couple key cross-functional things. It makes perfect sense that those should be consistent, but you're also going to help me with this pain, right? And then you partner with that team.
Right. So, interestingly, this is also our observation as well. I think the product teams, especially depending on the type of the product, they would work differently, or even the same product team would evolve how they work because the way you work is it's the same as your product, right? So you have to say what is the need, how do we adapt our process and practices to support that. So you did mention something also around the touch points where there are commonalities, or there's at least some minimum required commonalities because we do have to work together because 90% of the teams somehow rely on someone else to achieve their goals to deliver their outcomes. So what do you see in that case? Are some of the common that you mentioned about the sort of the growth team 0 to 1 is a bit different from platform team. What are some of the commonalities that cross the product teams that are uniform, but that are like a low-hanging fruit that companies are not doing that? Or what are the things when they force down consistency that actually become a friction because it doesn't work? So how
I'll
do
give
you
you,
see
yeah,
that?
I'll give you a great example. Well, I think it's a great example, but when you are preparing to go to market with a product or a feature or a change, if the company doesn't have like, I don't know what our industry term for this is, I forget, but I think if you call it like stage gating, if we don't have ways of explaining to front end teams, where is this feature or product in its go to market lifecycle? Like, is this alpha, meaning you can't talk about this? Or is this something that we're slowly rolling out to customers? Is this an experiment? Is this being ring released out to this segment of customers? If you don't have that standardized, then yes, your sales team is going to misunderstand you and sell stuff that you don't have. This happens in B2B all the time. So those are the sorts of things that you should standardize. And so when product people are talking about their work, there's a simple label that they can use to be like, this is where it's at, people, right? You should all know what that means. So that's a good example. If you don't have that, I'm not saying these two things are always related, but I do recall in the past there was one team where I felt like our way of communicating where things were was not clear. So then we tried to roll out an NPI process, new product introduction process. And it's a framework that a product ops team would run to essentially stage gate manage the cross-functional effort around the company's kind of like program management, right? So you want to go to market with something. How do we make sure all the different organizations are on the same page? There's a time and a place for that, but in some cases, I feel like we flipped to an overkill situation because we just weren't good at standardizing our communication of where this product is at. So if you standardize your communication, that's probably the first thing that I'd look for. I'd like to think that you can rely on people to do what needs to be done. And only if that's not working can you then go and say, maybe we need a process here.
Right.
So
Well,
there's a few other options. There's
right.
some cross-functional touch points, how you communicate to different teams, how you gather information from different teams, how you involve product marketing and begin a go-to-market process. Those are the top ones that come to mind.
Right. And it's interesting you mentioned something that I would say it become a more and a more visible where there's an era in the time where product managers in the earlier eras are actually very commercial. They're facing customers. They're doing a lot of like some of them are GMs, right? And then there's a lot of work actually happening on engineering. And then at some period of time, there's like such a big growth of product owners, like product managers are so embedded in engineering process. And even today in AI, there's like a product manager talking about like vibe coding and stuff. Look, don't get me wrong, I think it's okay, right? But if you're a product manager try to compete the same job of a designer as an engineer, who's going to care about the customers? Who wants to care actually bring the product to market? So the way I want to highlight is this, right? People think about dependencies, tend to think about technical dependencies. People tend not to think about, especially for product or some of the product executives, to think about a product before it goes to market and being adopted by customer is a cost.
Mhm.
So until it is go to market and it being adopted by customer, turn into a value, it become an ROI item. So if a product manager ends at ship the code, then you're not product manager. You're like Scrum Master, backlog manager than actually the commercial part. So that dependency set, the customer and the go-to-market dependency is even more important because to be honest, the shipping or coding is mostly solved, right? So
Yeah.
there's a lot of room for you. So that's the first part is about the dependencies. And I think that you brought up like dependencies and it goes beyond the product is really, really critical. Second part, I think, is where and we can definitely dive deeper into the sort of the AI impact, right? Today, the speed of shipping is just so tremendous. Then it's how much, not just the rest of the bottleneck, like how much even your customer can absorb it. And there's a false signals. It's like even worse. You send the false signals regardless your PDLC is not well defined, not understood, or
Mm.
to me it was like no source of truth. That's like what do you expect? Your agent just stops at a manual work, or you can infer manual work, of course, but the success of the inference every time is a variable. So now with that, let's talk about how AI and decision and a broader scope in product and the product ops you're seeing and what's working and what remains to be adapted.
Yeah, okay. It's interesting. I've run into that problem, the whole, hey, customers can only ingest so much before AI. So for example, B2C, sure, you can remove a lot faster because there's so many ways that you can release, right? But with B2B, you tend to really want to control your releases. And I was in a company once where one of the teams that was basically doing a flagship new product went full CI/CD. I was like, why? Why do I need continuous deployment, guys? I'm really confused because you realize that you're still not releasing that until we hit our monthly cycle because that's the business's mandate. So AI is the exact same thing. If you're trying to use it to increase the velocity of releases and stuff, it's going to get held up anyway if the company has a policy around when it releases to customers. And then, as you said, on the front end, if you're bombarding customers with changes all the time, I have a product I won't name where this is happening to me. I'm getting really frustrated with the UI because a very important button disappeared, and I was like, "Where's that button? Why does it move 3 times in the last month?" But yeah, AI in this case for me, I don't know if I don't know if I've seen things that other people haven't seen. It feels pretty standard, but the major lift is on the front side, on the front end, so the discovery side. There's tools like Reforge Insights, which we bring into companies as soon as we can because it completely changes the game for a product manager when it comes to working with qualitative information. So it's the speed to decision and what you can do with that information. And then from the product ops perspective, it's also on the quantitative side. We recently, with one of the companies, and we've done this several times, we helped get all the product managers' cursor licenses so that they could connect to their data warehouse directly and then educated them over multiple sessions bringing in people who are really good at this on how to actually work with the data yourself, leveraging AI to get there quickly. We work with some big companies, right? So in big companies, that initial discovery can be extremely slow. Getting access to customers can be a big process. Getting the information, getting analysis done can be a massive process because they're still in the world where they hand it over the fence to like a business analyst to do the analysis and then give it back to the product manager. So AI is changing that dynamic because now the product manager can go straight to the source and then talk to the analyst afterward just to validate. Did I mess this up because it's some AI SQL query? Can you validate the accuracy for me, please, while I already start telling my product leader about the insight or the hypothesis or what I want to do here? So the speed to decision is where the speed is like really valuable. Product managers can get through a lot more thought processes a lot faster. On the execution side, I think you're still limited by the business motion.
Right. And I think to your point that, you're talking about two things. One is there are, just like every function, product managers as well, that there are certain things that you have to do but it's very challenging to do because the resources, the effort, the technical skills or limitations. Definitely AI helps a lot because you can access the data and you can analyze the data much, much better. It definitely helps for product managers. The funny thing you mentioned, well, there's one thing very big for us is we call it source of truth, right? Imagine everyone look at different sources of truth. You have a different versions of a reality, which is very challenging. So I like how you guys said you have a data warehouse where everyone go there versus everyone download we've definitely seen companies doing stuff like this, right? They download a bunch of calls and then you analyze that. And then you start to have a different opinion.
Yeah.
And because you're based on different set of data. So source of truth is really critical in especially in AI worlds, right? Otherwise you just don't have the consistency, or at least not that consistency is the most important thing, but at least if we're not apples and oranges, which happens all the time in products, very challenging.
That becomes
Yeah, go ahead.
the key role for teams like whatever you call it, but these like centralized business analyst teams that maybe report into finance or something. The role for them becomes a lot more about focusing on the source of truth and making that clean, so that if you want to install something like Reforge Insights, it's not a plug and play. Like you have to make sure that your data is ingested correctly, cleaned. There's a lot of processing that has to be done on it, so you need resources to do it, but it pays its weight in gold once you set it up.
Right,
So
right.
that becomes a big use case for teams like product ops and the data teams, is making sure that those sources are clean. And then you also have the flip side, right? Is one thing I hear people complaining about a lot from product teams now that they have AI is everybody creates their own artifacts to share information. So you end up with AI generated pages and dashboards all over the place. Oh, I'm share this one with this person and this one with this person. And then someone's trying to find it again and like, what was that? Oh, it was an AI generated web page that I used instead of sending you a spreadsheet. And
Right.
you that's fine and well and good. You just need to know the mode that you're working in. It's like, look, am I pinging someone with an idea? Send them something that's ephemeral and going to disappear tomorrow. But if it's being brought into a bigger meeting or something that like the context and the historical context matters, again, that's another area product ops can help with, which is making sure that those sources of truth stay accurate. The information that we give to our partners is still done through a consistent medium.
Right. And you're just pitching the exactly why Dragonboat exists, right? That where the source of truth
Yeah.
is your product operating model that ties to all your objects so that you can generate as many views, as many things, but entities coming from the same source. But if you go hitting different warehouses, different things, then everyone gets a different version of the reality, which is very challenging. But that's really true. Like, that's why, for especially in today's world, like you said, like if you're in the finance, your role is no longer creating reports, right? The analyst's role is to say, hey, I need to make sure the data is high quality so that then we democratize the data access, the analytics. So that's very interesting to hear that. Now, also you mentioned in some of the, sort of the input you shared earlier before you coming on this call is around everywhere that, talking about the finance and marketing and meeting preps and all that stuff, it's being automated with the human in the loop. And so want to hear a little bit more of how do you see companies doing that, especially across the product team, that sort of automate what and then human in the loop what, and what are the things they like low hanging fruit or things are not working well that should be really revisited?
I'm talking about human in the loop use of AI. I'm really thinking about the anytime you're doing like documentation and communicating with artifacts, right? Or anytime you're doing decision making. So, for example, if you're a product manager, one thing I was always trying to do in the past before AI was really prevalent was helping product managers save a lot of time recreating the same message over and over again. So I was trying to get them to come from a product brief and update the artifact as you go through your life cycle so that it's easier each time. So when it's time to write a release note, for example, it's a low lift, not a high lift for you to go and rethink your language. AI, because you have stored context, and if you have access to things like Claude Code, which are skill-based, and you can create
Right.
structure around it, then you have historical context, and basically every meeting you ever have is recorded. And when meetings end, you can just talk to yourself, which is you talking to your agent that's going to process the call. That all kind of just happens in the background now. So if I'm starting to work on a problem, I have the context always with me, always updating behind me, sanitizing, cleaning behind me. So every day, my artifacts to describe what I'm working on are basically always up to date. The human in the loop part just means that like you have to not get lazy and just assume that what your agents are doing is accurate. Like if you're a domain expert in your field, you should be seeing an error daily minimum. Like these things they're often wrong. They'll pattern match where a pattern doesn't exist. So you still have to read what you produce, but it's an incredible time saving. And
Yeah.
it actually really helps with organization because you just have to tell the agent one time, this is how documentation is stored and organized. Everything will be where it should be now because it's a computer. It doesn't make that kind of mistake.
The challenge is always to catch you up in the place you never thought. Everything works so well, and all of a sudden something break. And
Yeah.
therefore, so having the ability, and then maybe you have two agents, right? So you have a review agent by someone else review that. But I think the other part about this is probably broader, right? Individually, it's a relatively limited scope and relatively consistent because after a while there's some more consistency on that. The human in the loop, what I observed is broader, is around when you have multiple person, multiple agent, and multiple context, and
Mhm.
also broader impact. If I send something out to someone else versus just working my draft copy, there's a different organizational impact and also the churn, like you mentioned earlier, as well. But in general, I agree with you. There are so many ways that you can think about using AI or agents and tools, and that's evolving every day to
Yeah.
make you more efficient. But I think also the other part of that is the reviewing and detecting drift is equally important, especially when you have things that are broader impact.
Yeah, I have maybe an example that's just unique to me and my consulting business. So I don't know how much this carries over to typical SaaS companies or whatever, but an example where this works for me is when I'm researching a company that, I want to work with. I used to have a very convoluted automated process for analyzing a call and updating the system of record. It's broken up into, I think, three sub-steps now, and each one cannot move forward without me in the loop. And that was done because of AI is just making mistakes over and over again, right? So the level of quality is significantly better. I basically don't worry about it anymore. I trust the information I have. And it is because anytime something, like if you're reading a skill document and it's kind of hard to understand or even hard to remember what's in there, it's too big. And
Yeah.
you can probably phase it out and then put yourself in the loop each time.
Right. What you mentioned is exactly true, which is how do you define the scope? The bigger scope can always be broken down to a smaller one. The smaller the scope, the more likely that it's clear and less likely to have problems.
Yeah.
So I know we're coming up on time. I do want to have one last question. We have so much good talk. It's really cool. One of
Amazing.
the things you mentioned in the what you wish worked differently is the role of product ops. And you mentioned it's not set up to succeed. So tell me a little bit more about that. If you have more time, I have time all the way to the hour.
Yeah, me too. It's not a statement I meant like, oh, product ops isn't set up to succeed everywhere. Like I've definitely seen it working really, really well. I've just noticed a few trends. We kind of touched on it in the beginning. I've been working with a couple product ops leaders recently, and it was reflecting some experience that I had in the past where if you recall, we talked about the operating system being different levels. And I mentioned when we talked about level one of the top-down authority and intent being outsourced, that's what I'm referencing. It's basically, to sum it up, when I suspect product leadership trying to outsource a part of their role to product ops. And then it becomes a little bit hazy as to what exactly is product ops role here because they don't manage the product team. They don't have authority over what product managers do. They're supposed to be essentially building a platform. But whether or not product teams are using that platform is a behavior aspect. And driving good behavior in product teams is not the role of product ops, in my opinion. That is the role of their leaders. So I've been in a situation before where I'm trying to work on empowering the teams, but I'm not being met with the same top-down intent to actually drive the behavior of that. And it feels a little bit like an impossible challenge sometimes because I've seen a couple product ops leaders where they have very little interface face or FaceTime with, say, the CPO. There's a big gap there. And product ops doesn't work in that environment, in my opinion. It just doesn't because you need a tighter relationship with your executive stakeholders in the work that you do because it's so foundational. So what I was alluding to is generally speaking the idea that oh, I can bring in product ops, and because operations is in the title, anything I think of as ops is now their job. No, everything's co-authored. You have to be a little bit more specific with what they do versus what you do. And I really do look at product ops more like the platform team, but the driver of the usage of that platform is still the people using it, which would be product design engineering. I look to those VPs to be the ones really driving the standard.
Right. Interesting concept. I think I definitely agree with you on sort of the levels of product, right? You think about a product organization, it really goes, I would look at three dimensions. There will be product executives, CPOs, right? And then you would have obviously product managers. And then you would sometimes people go to engineering as well. What people often don't see, one missing part is the product executives, but it's not just the product executives, and their stakeholders as well. CTO and VP of engineering often has a very, very strong influence on what is going on for your product operating model, right? And then also the other part of that is the external stakeholders, regardless of the revenue leaders or revenue teams and customer teams. And what I think that only way for product organization be successful is that a product ops would partner with
Mhm.
the leaders so that it makes sure that the ecosystem is healthy. Otherwise, if you plant a plant in a desert, whatever you have, it's not going to work. The ecosystem is not there. The second part I think you mentioned, and I think it's similar to sort of understanding product ops role is hiring the wrong people. Often I've seen people hire like APM and junior PMs to be product ops. I say, how could
Yeah.
that level of experience and skills to operating the whole product organization, like that's like a very big role. You need a very big
Mhm.
experience and scope to be able to orchestrate that level. So I think these two things, at least what I've seen, are the case. Have you? Do you want to?
I've seen that for sure. I'm thinking of a couple product managers who are young that I know are now moving into, product ops, and that can work if they're given the right scope. I definitely agree with you. It doesn't make sense to take people who aren't really, oh, it's maybe not working out so well in product management, like go do product ops. Like it's probably not going to work out so well there either. You have to match people to the right scope. Another example of where I'm seeing it is actually at the leadership end. I've seen this twice recently, where a larger organization going through a change has brought over someone who ran the project management team to be the director of their newly founded product operations team. Moving people from one role to another in a company is a healthy thing. It's a good thing. If they're performing well somewhere else and they want an opportunity, give it to them. But you really need to give those people time to learn product operations because it is not program management. Program management is very much time and cost bound. There's a start and an end, generally speaking, in software projects like that. Operations is not. It's more abstract, it's more messy, it's more systems based, and you need to be more comfortable with things that don't have a neat end date. And it's not always clear who your stakeholder and alignment is. That is a new skill. And I think that some people, there are some organizations who are going through these changes, they don't really think of it that way. I think in the planning of it, operations is reduced to something tactical. So
Right,
it looks like you can pair the two together. Some of the skills carry over, but some of them don't.
right.
And I'm not saying those people can't do it. They can do it, but they need to be given the time. And unfortunately, they're often thrown into the fire.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it tend to be something is broken, they bring someone in to fix it. So there's tendency of having a timeline and have deliver to something like that. But I agree with you. The difference between product and a project is the product never dies, right? Until you want it to die, right? So you sunset a product. Until then you continuously improving it. Project and the program does end, then you have another one. So that's definitely a very different mentality. Think about it. I want to add a spicy comment here, and that's something I always think about it, is that I think about a product and also like a revenue team side by side. I was like, every team, regardless of your, sales or marketing, customer success, they have a hard metrics that you hit it, you don't hit it, right? So that there's a drivers for people to do certain things because like nobody wants to update Salesforce, like nobody wants to, right?
Mhm.
But why they do because it's needed as a part of their success. They will get data, others get data, and then there's a lot of other pieces to it. And then even for engineering, they have a hard metrics, right? The qualities or whatever. Product doesn't.
Mm.
Product doesn't have a hard metrics. You don't have a way to say this product manager is great. That product manager, not so much. I don't
Yeah.
have a way to measure it. It's a very subjective. People can do good talks. People can give you good presentation. They give you all the data, or there's no measurable thing for product. I think it's changing, and I think it's very important. By the way, I came from a background where
Mm.
product are very business oriented when we were there, right? So we have like, if your product managers in, let's say, the fraud teams, your numbers are fraud. Like there's it, like fraud and that. And then you have a counterbalance to say, okay, you cannot impact a conversion. If you impact conversion, then the conversion team can say, hey, look, you decline every transaction. I have no revenue, right? So there's a very hard number to drive that. It takes effort to figure out a number, right? Like that's going back to your thing. It's easy. Like to me, I think at the front end of things, sure, it's busy. You had to understand what customer needs and whatever, right? You can get data, do this. Then what?
Mm.
Where's my ROI there? Because the product managers are not measured in that number. So then
Mhm.
all the behavior changes and all the stuff are not tied together. That's my take. Like, but coming out of measure for each of the product areas is different. So there's a
Yeah.
work involved. Until
Some,
then,
yeah, sorry. Some product managers have it better than others, of course. The problem here is that you can't paint everything with the same brush, right? So there are some product managers where it is easy to tie their results to performance of that product because it's self-contained and they have a lot of control. But, if you're just implementing, a feature in a broader product, how are you supposed to really understand the impact to the business? it is a bit more abstract in that case for sure. And some product managers are, asked to work on the new greenfield stuff where others are not. And so I've definitely heard in the coffee chats at the lunchroom table this kind of complaint, from product managers where it's like, how do you, it feels almost like a bit of a luck in it of how do you get on the type of work that does have a measure behind it.
Right. It's very definitely something that um it's a starting point for conversation, I would say. But I
Hmm.
do think that's probably a combination of product manager themselves to say how I for at least for this period of time, how I can measure my impact of my product
Yeah.
and
Also on the product leaders, right?
and align with the leaders. If you don't,
Yeah.
then it's also a problem, right? Because I think if I were anything, I would say today in today's world where AI is changing everything, there's a lot of uncertainty. Some what product managers do, so you can't just say it's a matter of a taste. It's a matter of craft. I mean, sure, but how
Mm,
do you measure that? So maybe it's another day, another time. Uh,
maybe.
but I do think that as our industry evolving so much, it's always great to have the guests like you come on to talk
You're
about
welcome.
what's working, what's not working, and really great insight today. Anything you want to add before we close up?
No, I'm good. Thank you very much for having me. I've enjoyed the conversation. I look forward to hearing more of them. And so, I'll be staying tuned as well. I just appreciate
Awesome.
it.
Cool. And if I were to close this up, is that as AI and agentic workflow moving things forward, the ability to have a reliable source of truth so that you can dump all the things into your second brain or organizational brain around your product and the portfolio and customer and metrics outcome, as well as to have reliable sources so that you can communicate with the people without drift too much and hallucinating much, then you should think about having a system like a Dragonboat that's built for agentic product operating model. Cool. Until next time, thank you, Courtney.